Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Ukraine to participate in this meeting. The Council is so decided. The provisional agenda for this meeting is, in accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Miroslav Yenta, Assistant Secretary General for Europe, Central Asia and Americas in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, and Mr. Matthew Hollingworth, Representative and Country Director in Ukraine at the World Food Programme. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Olof Skog, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Miroslav Yenta.
Mr. President, last weekend we reached a new grim milestone in the war in Ukraine. The Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights has confirmed that to date more than 10,000 civilians have been killed and more than 18,500 injured since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in violation of the UN Charter and international law. Hundreds of children are among the victims. The full toll of this war is likely to be much greater, as there is no sign of the end of the violence. Instead, there are indications that attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure may escalate further during the upcoming coldest season. The impact for millions of Ukrainians will be dire as they brace themselves for the second wartime winter. Since I last briefed this Council less than 2 weeks ago, Russian aerial attacks across the country have continued to inflict death and destruction to areas near and far from the front lines. On 11 November, Kiev was attacked by missiles, first time in 2 months. While the capital was spared from casualties that night, attacks on Kiev and its region have continued. The city was attacked by drones just this weekend. On the same day, strikes killed 4 people, 2 in Kherson, 1 in Dnipropetrovsk, and another in Zaporizhia region, according to local officials. The city of Kherson, recaptured by Ukraine over a year ago, has continued to suffer regular intense bombardments, resulting in civilian deaths. Last week, at least 9 people were reportedly killed in the region, and 25 more, including a 2-month-old child, injured. In the Black Sea, the risk of escalation and spillover remains. On 9 November, in Odessa, a missile reportedly hit a cargo vessel, killing a port worker and wounding crew members of the ship. Landmines posing risks to civilian navigation have been reported. A military incident in the Black Sea, whether intentional or not, could result in dangerous escalation. Global food security depends on the ability of food exports to move safely and predictably through international waters, including in the Black Sea. We once again stress that attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure are prohibited under international law. Wherever they occur, they are unacceptable and must stop immediately. Mr. President, amidst fresh waves of attacks against energy infrastructure and in anticipation of frigid weather conditions, humanitarian needs are on the rise. Last Friday's drone strikes alone resulted in power cuts in more than 400,000 villages in the south, southeast and north of the country. They also damaged an oil depot in Odessa. This year's winter response plan, developed by the United Nations and its partners in full cooperation with the Ukrainian authorities, is already in full swing. International solidarity and support for winter and beyond, including through timely donor contributions, remains essential. Some 360,000 people have already received winter support, but $435 million are still urgently required to deliver house repair materials, winter clothes, heating appliances, fuel and repairs to district water and heating systems for 1.7 million people in need. Continued contributions are also needed for the 2023 humanitarian response plan for Ukraine, currently only 54% funded. UN agencies have provided humanitarian assistance to over 10 million people this year. We aim to reach 11 million by the end of 2023. Regrettably, around 4 million Ukrainians in need cannot be reached in Russian-controlled areas of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia regions of Ukraine due to lack of access. They receive only minimal aid through local actors in partnership with the UN and international non-governmental organizations. Humanitarian partners are ready to expand operations in these areas if given access and adequate support. Mr. President, the destruction wrought on the country will take years, decades to overcome. The United Nations is actively working towards long-term recovery and rebuilding of the country's energy sector. We focus on infrastructure support for energy generation and transmission for the functioning of basic utilities, heating, water and sewage in war-affected areas. In collaboration with the government of Ukraine, the World Bank and the European Union, the United Nations has initiated the third Ukraine Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment. It will guide the Ukrainian government's investment priorities for recovery and reconstruction next year. The previous assessment has had estimated recovery costs for Ukraine at over $400 billion. We are committed to advancing an inclusive recovery based on rights and local needs in communities affected by the war, leaving no one behind. Regrettably, this war continues to cause often irreversible damage to Ukraine's education sites and hinder children's right to education. The Ukrainian authorities have reported that 365 educational institutions were destroyed and at least 3,428 damaged. We are also concerned about the disregard of international law in the regions of Ukraine currently under Russian control. Russian officials are holding so-called elections, appointing Russian judges and applying Russian law, even retroactively. Policies aimed at forcefully changing or imposing institutions and identities have far-reaching consequences and are unacceptable. The UN Human Rights Office has also continued to document cases confirming that the use of torture has been widespread in the context of arbitrary detention in territories of Ukraine that are currently under Russian control. Accountability for all violations of human rights must be ensured, in line with international norms and standards. Mr. President, in September, the Secretary General urged all countries to do their part to prevent further escalation in Ukraine and to lay the foundations for sustainable peace. Instead, attacks have increased and conditions on the ground deteriorated. While prospects for peace may seem distant and the risk of further escalation looms, urgent efforts must be undertaken to minimize the impact on civilians. Amidst global challenges and crises, the international community must sustain its focus on Ukraine and end the suffering caused by this war. As the Secretary General underlined, peace in Ukraine must remain a priority. A just and lasting peace, in line with the Charter, international law, and the resolutions of the General Assembly. We remain ready to support all meaningful efforts to that end. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Yentsa for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Matthew Hollingworth.
Thank you, Mr. President. On behalf of the World Food Programme, I'm honoured to appear before the United Nations Security Council today. I will briefly speak about the humanitarian consequences of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and in particular, the impact on food security, both domestically and globally. Today, because of hostilities, Ukrainians are being cut off from accessing markets to buy food, and farmers are reporting that they can no longer produce enough food, a situation that has a dramatic impact inside and outside Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is driving food insecurity inside the country, and this is a country that used to feed 400 million people around the world per year before February 2022. Right now, we know from our surveys that in 80% of the settlements close to the front line, people face barriers to accessing food. Today, around 1 in 5 Ukrainian families face some level of severe food insecurity. The closer someone lives to the hostilities, the more critical are those needs. And as a result, over 900,000 people still living within 30 kilometers of the front line have the most acute and severe food insecurity needs, which only worsens in the winter. The World Food Programme is feeding some 750,000 of these people with food baskets throughout the winter. And additionally, another 1.5 million people who have broader needs will receive some form of cash assistance in areas that have been directly affected by the conflict, but where markets are still working. Consistently, when people are asked about their priority needs, food, access to medicine, and indeed shelter in the winter come out on top. Whilst responding to the food security needs, the irony should not be lost on us that in one of the world's most formidable breadbaskets, there are hundreds of thousands of people living in proximity to the hostilities that now depend on humanitarian and food assistance with no obvious way to cope. Mr. President, the humanitarian needs in the country are sadly but fundamentally linked to the consequences of the war in Ukraine, on agriculture and on rural food-producing communities. The impact on Ukrainian agriculture is not only about big numbers and metric tons produced and grains exported, it's also about the impact on the everyday life of citizens of the country. Today, the war means fields are contaminated with mines and unexploded ordnance, and households are unable to grow the food they need to feed themselves. Approximately 174,000 square kilometers, roughly 30% of Ukraine's territory, have been affected by the conflict and are potentially contaminated by remnants of war. And out of this great number, 25,000 square kilometers is agricultural food-producing land. And this was some of the most productive land in the country. Despite farming less than 7% of the country's land, it's the smallholder farmers in Ukraine that contribute to 75% of the employment sector within this sector. And they have been the most adversely affected by the war. As an example, last week I was in Kharkivska Oblast, visiting an agricultural demining project that the World Food Programme manages with the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. The households there are twice as likely to have inadequate food consumption when they cannot have access to their own land to produce their own food. But the war in Ukraine has also meant that there are continuing attacks on port and grain infrastructure. A forthcoming report by the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights will really reveal some findings since mid-July. That is that since then, 31 documented attacks targeting facilities crucial to grain production and grain export from the country. 28 of those attacks were in Odessa Oblast alone, which is the home to the vital Black Sea and Danube River terminals, essential for global trade in food. If attacks on food infrastructure and the blockage of sea export routes continue, it will dramatically impact the agricultural production outlook over years to come, and may, in a worst-case scenario, lead to wheat production being unable to meet domestic and export demands. This export of produce means that people are fed around the world. It's important to remember, Ukraine accounted for 9% of global wheat exports, 15% of maize exports, 44% of sunflower oil exports before February 2022. Mr. President, our task is now threefold. First, we must continue to address the acute and urgent humanitarian food needs facing millions of Ukrainians. As we do this, we must not lose sight of the food system recovery efforts that are required. The latest or the last rapid damage and needs assessment estimated that the country has already experienced a $40.2 billion loss in damages to the agricultural sector. And Ukrainian farmers and Ukrainian rural communities most affected need our support, or indeed, they will be left behind. Third, alongside the rest of the United Nations, the World Food Programme and others has to work to ensure that there continues to be a viable market for the food that's produced in Ukraine. Otherwise, there's simply no incentive for farmers to farm. This includes working to reduce the enormous increase in logistic costs created by any hindrance to the use of Black Sea ports. Mr. President, we must all keep our efforts on the immediate needs in this country, but also on the long game, to ensure that this agricultural powerhouse can be quickly put back on its feet and made able to feed the world's hungry. Because when a next food crisis happens globally, the world will continue to need Ukraine. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Hollingworth for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Mr. President, and thank you to Assistant Secretary Yenka and WFP Country Director Hollingworth for your briefings today. This month, we mark the 90th anniversary of the Holodomor, which translates to death by starvation. Death by starvation. Millions of Ukrainian women, men, children perished because of Stalin regime's harsh and repressive policies, because of a man-made deliberate famine. It has become a cautionary tale of what happens when we let cruelty and tyranny go unchecked. But Putin has not taken heed. Rather, he's taken inspiration. Like Stalin, Putin has used food as a weapon of war. And like Stalin, Putin has inflicted hunger and death on Ukraine. And let's be clear, Russia is not only waging war on Ukraine's people and food supply, it is also waging war on vulnerable people around the world who rely on Ukraine's food exports. We know that Russia has exacerbated global food insecurity. Prior to Russia's full-scale invasion, Ukraine was one of the top agricultural producers and exporters. But Ukraine's wheat production is 35% lower than pre-war levels. Why? Because Russia has stolen Ukrainian grain, sabotaged farmlands, and bombarded Ukraine's agricultural infrastructure and port cities. One Russian attack destroyed 60,000 tons of grain, which according to the WFP would have been enough to feed more than 270,000 people for a year. Despite these relentless attacks, the Ukrainian people have stood strong, and they continue to be a beacon of hope to the world's most vulnerable. Ukrainian farmers continue to harvest crops even in the face of grave danger. And for a long time, grain was getting out to the world through the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which was brokered by the UN and Turkey. More than 60% of wheat exported through this initiative went to developing economies, including those at risk of severe hunger and malnutrition. But Russia decided to unilaterally end this arrangement without cause and without regard for the needs of developing countries. Still, Ukraine was not deterred. By setting up a Black Sea grain corridor for ships to pass through Kyiv, Kyiv is doing everything in its power to feed the world. Russia predictably hates this. It has threatened to attack cargo vessels in the port of the Black Sea, and earlier this month, there were reports that Russia struck a civilian vessel in the port of Pivdeny. These actions compromise shipping safety and commercial activity, and we must all call on Russia to comply with its international legal obligations and respect freedom of navigation. Colleagues, President Putin is counting on us. He's counting on us to become numb to the horrors his forces have carried out, the killing and the torture and the rape and other forms of sexual violence, the indiscriminate attack on civilian structure, the illegal forcible transfer and deportation of Ukraine's children to Russia and Russian-occupied territories, as well as the transport of children from Russian-occupied territories to Belarus. And Putin is hoping that given the number of crises before us in Sudan and Syria and the DRC and Yemen and Israel and Gaza, we will forget about the plight of the Ukrainian people. I also expect you will hear Russia try to change the topic today and throw a litany of whataboutisms our way. As U.S. Secretary of Defense Austin said during his visit to Kyiv yesterday, and I quote, "The United States will continue to stand with Ukraine in their fight for freedom against Russia's aggression, both now and into the future." Colleagues, we must not let Russia trample on the UN Charter. We must not let Russia carry out war crimes with impunity, and must not let Russia continue to weaponize food and inflict so much pain and suffering on Ukraine by attacking Ukraine's critical infrastructure as the cold, dark winter approaches. Let us all stand with the Ukrainian people for as long as it takes, until families are reunited, until children can go back to school, and people can return home, and until a just and comprehensive peace in accordance with the UN Charter is secured. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States. I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
And let me also thank USG Yensa and Mr. Hollingworth for their briefings. Colleagues, while the world attention remains glued on the ongoing dramatic developments in Gaza, with hope that some of the much-awaited good news will come soon, the aggression against Ukraine continues unabated, with terrible humanitarian consequences and profound detrimental impact on human lives, including for many around the world. We like it or not, the world media and public attention have their own patterns. They can only focus on one event at a time. Nothing can or should diminish the tragedy unfolding in Gaza. But we cannot forget that civilians are dying every day in a disastrous war in Sudan, that a horrible civil war is going on almost in silence in Myanmar, and that the cruelty of Russia in Ukraine has not stopped, to mention just a few human miseries of our world. This is why this meeting is important as a very much needed reality check. Briefers shared the latest information on several key aspects, and we welcome it. In the course of almost 2 years, Russia has reduced whole Ukrainian cities to rubble, has conducted indiscriminate attacks with shelling, missiles and drones against civilians and civilian infrastructure, including schools and hospitals, has caused a massive humanitarian crisis, and is guilty of multiple crimes and crimes against humanity. The reports established by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, based on numerous missions to Ukraine and other evidence, show beyond any doubt that the Russian authorities have committed a wide range of violations, many of which amount to war crimes. They include willful killing, attacks on civilians, unlawful confinement, torture, rape and sexual violence, as well as forced transfers and deportations of children. Colleagues, just a few days ago, Ukraine commemorated the 90th anniversary of Holodomor, otherwise known as the Great Famine. In 1932-33, millions of Ukrainians were starved to death in a man-made famine engineered by the Soviet government of Joseph Stalin. In 2023, in a man-made war, Kremlin continues to weaponize food against the same country and the same people, this time with reverberating effects around the world. As part of its efforts to subjugate its neighbor, Russia killed the grain deal, annihilating a much-needed food security relief worldwide. It continues to deliberately bombard and destroy Ukraine's export facilities and grain silos. It has wrecked and heavily mined vast parts of the agricultural land, inflicting huge damage to the country's economy and its output. What Russia didn't want, Ukraine is making now possible, thankfully. The food corridor is vital for Ukraine, but also for millions in the world. Colleagues, as we approach the 22nd month of uninterrupted, brutal war, let's take a moment and look at some key aspects of this war, probably a culmination of incompetence in strategic decision and political blunder has brought for Ukraine, for Russia, and the world. It was meant to be a 3-day promenade. It has been going on for over 620 days with no end in sight, bringing death and destruction for Ukraine, but also extraordinary costs for Russia itself. It promised to save and liberate Ukrainians. It has only brought misery and suffering, killed 10,000 innocent people, and has displaced more than 10 million others. It was meant to bring Ukraine closer to Russia. It has instead created a more unified, nationally conscious country and society than before the war. Ukraine has become a candidate country to the European Union, has strengthened its European credentials, and is making its choices free from the Russian dictate. It was meant to show the Russian strength and grandeur. It has instead proved a disastrous example of overreach. It has isolated Russia, which stands now as a weak pariah, perceived as a threat to democracies, to the European security architecture and the international security system. By invading its smaller neighbor, Russia showed its contempt for the rules-based international order. It has upset and challenged it, but the world, as shown by the UNGA, has not followed Russia. It has openly opposed and condemned it. A war based on bogus pretexts and alternative realities they have created and keep repeating has only revealed how little respect a permanent member of the Security Council has for the UN Charter, the international law and the Security Council resolutions, despite unsuccessful attempts to preach otherwise. Colleagues, history can always be a good advice to learn from the past and understand the present. In 1792, Maximilien Robespierre would warn about, and I quote, the most extravagant idea taking root in the head of a politician who believes that it is enough for one people to invade a foreign people to make it adopt its laws and constitution. No one likes armed missionaries, and the first advice given by nature and prudence is to repel them as enemies, end of quote. As incomprehensible as it may be, 231 years later, that extravagant idea and that kind of politicians are still around. Except that today, Robespierre's advice to repel enemies is enshrined in the UN Charter, in the international law, and is embodied in the worldwide solidarity with Ukrainians in their right for self-defense and their heroic resistance. It means that we have learned from past mistakes, at least some of us. This is why we will continue to support Ukraine's right and ability to defend itself against Russia's aggression, to uphold the fundamental principles of multilateralism, and to help the Ukrainian people build the secure, prosperous, and independent future they deserve. Because, let's not forget, for Ukraine, the defense efforts are a matter of survival. For Russia, the war has been and remains a matter of caprice and imperial design. Therefore, it is crucial not to allow Russia to go away with crime, the crime of changing borders by force, the crime of illegal annexation of territory, the crime of deliberate policy which could bring back anarchy in Europe and instability in the entire world. And this is why standing with Ukraine and its sovereignty and territorial integrity means defending the democratic values, the international rules-based order, the UN Charter, all of us, and what we stand for. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania. I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
President, I would like to thank Assistant Secretary General Mr. Miroslav Jensa and the World Food Programme Country Director for Ukraine, Mr. Matthew Hollingworth, for their briefings. As the Council turns its focus once again on the prevailing conditions in Ukraine and in particular the continuing effects of the war on food security, my delegation reiterates Ghana's firm support for a just, peaceful, and comprehensive political settlement. We continue to believe that diplomacy and dialogue are pertinent to redirecting the military fixation of the warring parties to the non-combatant peace efforts extolled by the principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Mr. President, much like the global finance and energy systems, the global food system, already under pressure from climate crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, has been manifestly affected by the war on Ukraine. As noted in the briefing, millions of people, especially in developing countries, including those reliant on exports under the World Food Programme, have been pushed closer to the brink of food insecurity and the threats of hunger and famine. With as many as 250 million people facing food insecurity worldwide, we worry over the growing risk that the war on Ukraine poses to many people far removed from the theaters of war. This is particularly the case today, as the Black Sea Grain Initiative that facilitated the export of some 30,000 metric tons of essential food, abated rising food prices, and met the pangs of hunger of many stands terminated. Grain storage facilities and ports have also been destroyed, reducing the already compromised export capacity of Ukraine by about 40%. We therefore join many others in encouraging continuing efforts by all relevant stakeholders to restore grain supplies to the global markets, with a priority for countries that are vulnerable and whose populations face famine and hunger. Mr. President, as the war grinds on with increasing risk to the lives and livelihoods of civilian populations, especially women, children, the aged and sick, we reiterate the necessity of unhindered access for humanitarian aid and assistance to address the heightened vulnerabilities arising from the frigid conditions of winter temperatures. We also highlight the dictates of international humanitarian law for the safety and protection of civilians during wartime, and call once more on the parties to align their actions with the humanitarian principles of distinction, proportionality, and military necessity. It cannot be said enough that civilians and civilian infrastructure are not and should not be targets of war. We close our statement by reiterating our appeal for an end to the war in Ukraine. Being fully convinced that there is no alternative to winning the peace in Ukraine, we strongly call on the parties to address their competing interests at the negotiating table and away from the battlefield. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of Ghana for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Assistant Secretary General Jenka and Representative and Country Director of the World Food Programme for their briefings. The war in Ukraine and the humanitarian needs continue to increase as we are seeing ongoing attacks on essential infrastructure, hospitals, Black Sea ports, schools, and housing. The living conditions for more than 3.7 million people that have been displaced is becoming increasingly difficult as winter approaches. In its last update, OCHA estimates that almost 1.7 million people will require assistance during the winter period. Since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the civilian toll is particularly alarming. More than almost 3,800 schools have been affected by the fighting or simply destroyed. To this, we must add the various attacks against health care units. My country would recall to the warring parties the requirement to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law, as well as all of the relevant resolutions of this Council. We'd like to restate that civilians and all of those people who are not part of the fighting must in no way be a target of attacks. We are alarmed at the proliferation of drone attacks, which continue to considerably worsen the effects of the conflict on the daily lives of the population. We reiterate to the parties that they must abstain from using any weapons in an indiscriminate and inhumane manner. Mr. President, in a global context where we see continued food insecurity with risks of famine in certain at-risk countries, we would recall that food infrastructure must not be the target of armed attack. The effects of the bursting of the Kakhovka Dam on the essential economic areas of activity in the area, such as agriculture and fishing, are potentially threats for the subsistence of the populations in the surrounding regions. It is crucial that these effects are dealt with and that measures be taken in order to enable the survival of the population affected. In conclusion, we reiterate our call for the parties that have an influence on the warring parties to give priority to diplomatic channels in order to put an end to this deadly conflict. Gabon would encourage all of the parties to prioritize dialogue in order to reach peace and peaceful coexistence. Thank you.
Okay.
I thank the representative of Gabon. I now give the floor to the representative of UAE.
Mr. President, I thank Assistant Secretary General Yencha and Mr. Hollingsworth for their briefings, and I welcome Ukraine's participation in today's meeting. As we just heard from our briefers, the lives of civilians in Ukraine remain precarious, a situation set to worsen given the onset of winter and a recent intensification of attacks on Ukraine's critical infrastructure. This situation is particularly concerning given that Ukraine's energy system is more vulnerable than it was at this time last year. There is little excess capacity and minimal spare equipment. Ensuring the consistent supply of electricity and heating during the coming months will be critical for the health and safety of the population in Ukraine. In eastern Ukraine, continued military engagements are putting civilians at risk. As fighting intensifies in various areas, civilian displacement is increasing. This is particularly challenging for the elderly and disabled, and we encourage all efforts to ensure their safety and provide them with assistance. Mr. President, following the expiration of the Black Sea Grain Initiative last July, conflict intensified in and around the Black Sea and its ports. This has negatively impacted Ukraine's ability to export grain and other food items. Reduced food exports not only impact Ukraine, but also people around the world who rely upon the stable and affordable supply of food. Indeed, on 3 August 2023, this Council re-emphasized the obligations of all parties to conflict to comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law regarding respecting and protecting civilian objects, including objects necessary for food production and distribution, such as food processing and storage sites, and hubs and means for food transportation. This reaffirmed many of the provisions of Resolution 2417, which highlighted international humanitarian law obligations to protect objects necessary for food production and distribution, and drew attention to the links between conflict and hunger. The law is clear, and we call for all parties to conflict to fully adhere to it. The Black Sea Grain Initiative was a practical mechanism to enable the protection of civilian objects required for food distribution, and it had a significant impact on global food security during the year it was in effect, enabling export of nearly 33 million metric tons of Ukrainian grains and foodstuffs. While we regret its expiry, we note the subsequent establishment of the Black Sea Corridor, which has facilitated the export of Ukrainian food and goods through the Black Sea on over 150 ships. We also reiterate that civilian objects remain protected under international humanitarian law at all times, whether or not they are part of the Black Sea Grain Initiative or Black Sea Corridor. We strongly encourage discussions to re-establish a joint mechanism to ensure the protection of civilian ports, shipping, and other necessary elements of food distribution, and to potentially create momentum for broader diplomatic breakthroughs. Mr. President, there remains only one way to put a sustainable end to this war's destructive impact on the people of Ukraine, its negative consequences for global food security, and to address its regional and international political repercussions, and that is to bring the conflict to a peaceful conclusion. We reiterate our call for a cessation of hostilities and a just and lasting peace which respects Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity in line with the UN Charter. We encourage all serious efforts to this end and stand ready to support them. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of UAE. I give the floor to Switzerland.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I'd like to join my colleagues in thanking Assistant Secretary General Yenka and the World Food Programme Representative and Country Director in Ukraine, Matthew Hollingworth, for their presentations. And I, too, on the 90th anniversary of the Holodomor, would like to firstly pay tribute to the millions of victims of this great famine caused by the Soviet regime. Our thoughts are with the victims, and above all, they are with the Ukrainian people who commemorate this wound every year. Mr. President, Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world. In normal times, it can feed it alone 400 million people a year. Combat operations since the start of Russia's military aggression have affected some of the best agricultural land in Ukraine. A third of the country is potentially contaminated, as we've heard, by mines and unexploded munitions, and targeted Russian attacks are destroying Ukraine's Black Sea grain and port infrastructure. Switzerland is deeply concerned by the adverse consequences of these actions for food security, not only in Ukraine, but also worldwide, especially in the most vulnerable countries. At a time when 1 in 10 people in the world suffers from chronic hunger, everything must be done to restore and protect Ukraine's capacities and stabilize supply chains. The solution to this is simple. Once again, and for the protection of the right to food worldwide, we urge Russia to cease its combat operations and withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory. And we once again reiterate our call for all parties to respect international humanitarian law and human rights. We recall that international humanitarian law prohibits attacks on goods essential to the survival of the civilian population. The serious damage caused to civilian property and objects, as well as the interruption of essential services such as water, electricity and heating, are particularly alarming as another winter season approaches. These attacks must stop immediately. Mr. President, as the impact of Russia's military aggression is felt around the world, we commend all those involved, including Ukraine itself, who are working tirelessly to help those suffering from food insecurity. Switzerland would like to thank the Secretary-General for giving priority to securing exports via the Black Sea. Nearly 33 million tons of grain and other foodstuffs have been exported under the Black Sea Initiative. We regret that by withdrawing from this initiative, Russia has extinguished this beacon of hope. Since then, more than 150 ships have used the humanitarian corridor launched by Ukraine in the Black Sea. We call on all parties to refrain from any action that could harm civilian shipping, as happened on November 8th. We also express our gratitude to the WFP, present with us today virtually. Its activities, in particular food distribution, cash assistance, and in Ukraine, agricultural demining, we've just heard about that, are essential to support vulnerable people. Switzerland is proud to have supported the WFP's efforts with almost $15 million since February 2022. Finally, I underline Switzerland's support for the Grain from Ukraine initiative, humanitarian food program. With just a few days to go before the second summit, we are looking forward to being able to continue today's discussions in Kiev. We will continue our commitment to global food security and to meeting urgent humanitarian needs. Together, we can return the mined land and destroyed infrastructure to their original state, a sea of grain fields. Because hunger should never be used as a weapon of war. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland. I now give the floor to France.
Mr. President, I'd like to thank Messrs. Janka and Hollingworth for their presentations. And I would like to stress two messages. Firstly, France continues to condemn the illegal war of aggression led by Russia against Ukraine. Since the 24th of February 2022, the Ukrainian people have been defending themselves courageously, although on a daily basis they suffer violence, crimes and torture. Russia is attacking civilian populations unrelentingly in violation of international humanitarian law. Since Friday, Kiev was targeted by several tens of Shahed drones. The Russian forces are also attacking essential infrastructure in Ukraine, in particular energy infrastructure. These indiscriminate attacks are worsening the situation for the population. More than 17 million people now require humanitarian assistance. As the winter approaches, we must remain fully committed. 300 million euro have been mobilized by France in order to respond to the urgent humanitarian needs and ensure the rehabilitation of essential infrastructure. Mr. President, France will continue to provide Ukraine with the necessary aid to enable it to exercise its legitimate defense enshrined in the United Nations Charter. We will also continue our support for Ukrainian jurisdictions and with the International Criminal Court in order to fight impunity. Instead of continuing to surge ahead and to imperil international peace and security, Russia must put an end to this war. It must cease its aggression and withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory, as demanded by the International Court of Justice on the 16th of March 2022. It must heed the calls of the General Assembly, which with an overwhelming majority affirmed and reaffirmed its commitment to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, and declared any attempt to annex Ukrainian territory as illegal with regard to international law. The restoring of sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine and the preservation of our collective security is at the heart of a vision for just and lasting peace developed by Ukraine. And here we would like to celebrate the meeting held in Malta on the 28th of October last, with an increasing number of states involved in the work. This war of aggression is worsening food insecurity. Russia has taken a unilateral decision to not renew the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and its repeated attacks against infrastructure of production and storage in Ukraine. On the 9th of November, Russia targeted a civilian ship in the port of Odessa, leading to the death of the captain and wounding several members of the crew and staff on land. This is the 21st attack against Ukrainian ports since last July. This shows that Russia continues to use food as a weapon. The consequences can be felt well beyond Ukraine by the most vulnerable populations. In response to this, France and the European Union have been, since the beginning of this crisis, acting in support of the maintenance of agricultural activities in Ukraine, in order to enable Ukrainian agricultural products to supply the world market, particularly through the solidarity lanes. France decided to strengthen its contribution to the World Food Programme to the tune of €166 million in 2023, including for the benefit of Ukraine. With our support, the World Food Programme and the FAO will be able to contribute to the demining of agricultural lands in Ukraine, thanks to an innovative project using artificial intelligence. France will continue to provide its support to the most vulnerable countries to food insecurity, with food aid that will exceed €950 million in 2023. We are participating in the Grain from Ukraine in Kiev meeting on the 25th of November, and also yesterday in London, the Global Food Security Summit. These are evidence of our commitment in this matter. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of France. I now give the floor to Japan.
Mr. President, I thank ISG Miroslav Yencha and WFP representative and country director in Ukraine, Matthew Hollingworth, for their briefings. More than 600 days have passed since the aggression against Ukraine began. Today, we once again pay our utmost respects to the Ukrainian people who are defending their country. There are numerous conflicts around the world. There is no silver bullet for identifying all the causes and effects of each one. However, this war of aggression is very different from other conflicts. Its causes could not be clearer. This unprovoked war of aggression was started by Russia, and Ukraine is fighting against it in accordance with the UN Charter to protect its own people, independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. There is a plethora of credible information from multiple sources, as well as ample evidence on the ground that the damage caused by Russia, disastrous humanitarian situation caused by Russia, is enormous. Russia continues to attack critical infrastructure, including power plants, causing the Ukrainian people to suffer as they enter their second winter since the beginning of the war. It has also withdrawn from the Black Sea Grain Initiative and destroyed port facilities that deliver food abroad, affecting not only Ukraine but the entire world. Mr. President, we reaffirm our commitment to address the growing needs of vulnerable countries and populations impacted by Russia's aggression. We welcome steps taken by Ukraine to strengthen export routes free of Russian control. We continue to fully support the export of Ukrainian agri-products, including through the EU-Ukraine Solidarity Lanes, Danube ports, and the Humanitarian Maritime Corridor. Mr. President, we remain steadfast in upholding and strengthening the free and open international order based on the rule of law, respecting the UN Charter. And in this regard, we reiterate our strong opposition to any unilateral attempts to change the peacefully established status of territories by force or coercion anywhere in the world. Such attempts undermine the rule of law, which protects all nations, especially the vulnerable, as well as global security and human dignity. It is unacceptable for an aggressor to profit from violating the UN Charter. A just and lasting peace cannot be realized without the immediate, complete, and unconditional withdrawal of Russia's troops and military equipment from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine. There must be no impunity for war crimes and other atrocities. Justice must be done, and those who are responsible for the undeniable atrocities that have taken place must be held accountable. Mr. President, our commitment to supporting Ukraine will never waver. We have always been with Ukraine and will stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for his statement, and I'll give the floor to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I also thank Assistant Secretary General Jenka and Mr. Hollingsworth for their briefing. Russia continues its relentless attacks on Ukraine's ports and grain infrastructure. It is a deliberate attempt to strangle the Ukrainian economy with total disregard for the impact on food. It follows Russia's cynical withdrawal from the Black Sea Grain Initiative, driving up global food prices and risking the lives of the world's most vulnerable. The cost of Russia's war to global food supplies is staggering. In just 1 month, Russia destroyed over 280,000 tons of grain, enough to feed over 1 million people for a year. Agriculture production costs have increased. Landmines have reduced the land available to farm. In frontline oblasts, households involved in agricultural production have reduced by a quarter. As well as its attack on food, Russia is repeating its strategy of attacking critical infrastructure in winter, attempting to break resolve by depriving the Ukrainian people of electricity, heat, water, and vital medical services. Russia will not succeed. Ukraine's resilience and the support of its international partners will remain strong. The United Kingdom will continue to work with Ukraine and our partners to ensure Ukraine is able to export its grain. The Unity Facility, launched last week between Marsh McClellan's UK division and the Ukrainian government, will provide affordable shipping insurance for grain and other critical food supplies from Ukraine's Black Sea ports. Ships are sailing, and Ukraine's grain is being exported. This week, the UK hosted a Global Food Security Summit, galvanizing action to tackle the causes of food insecurity and malnutrition, and unlock our diverse resources for a more resilient, food-secure future. We welcome Ukraine Summit next week, which will drive support for the Grain from Ukraine initiative. As my Foreign Secretary said in Ukraine last week, Russia thinks it can wait this war out, and that the West will eventually turn its attention elsewhere. This could not be further from the truth. The UK and our partners will support Ukraine and its people for as long as it takes for them to achieve victory and a just peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the UK, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Salvador.
Agradezco también la...
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Assistant Secretary General for Political Affairs, Mr. Miroslav Jenka, and Mr. Matthew Hollingworth, Representative and Country Director in Ukraine. Thank them both for their informative briefings. We're 3 months short of 2 years since the military aggression against Ukraine. We lament that this aggression continues to affect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, at the same time as it continues to defy the United Nations Charter, including principles such as multilateralism, and the banning of war as a means for solving disputes, conflicts. We would reiterate that the security of one state cannot be placed above the security of any other. We would also recall that the annexation of territory by force does not have any validity at all, and that the arguments invoked in order to justify this invasion hold no water legally. We would also recall that all of the provisions of the International Court of Justice must be complied with, regardless of whether they relate to Europe or the Middle East or Latin America or Africa. Furthermore, the members of this Council, and in particular the permanent members, are the first who are called upon to respect the decisions of the highest court of this organization. We also regret that this aggression continues to exacerbate the risks of a nuclear accident, as well as narratives and actions which weaken the international disarmament architecture. We also deplore the cost that this war is having on civilian infrastructure, including agricultural infrastructure and infrastructure of production, storage, and distribution of food. We would reiterate the need for all parties to a conflict to fully comply with Resolution 2573 for the protection of goods that are indispensable for the survival of a civilian population. We recognize the work of the World Food Programme in Ukraine and the support for millions of people in the context of food insecurity brought about by war. Support for internally displaced is also to be commended. Since the beginning of the invasion, the Secretary-General alerted us to the global consequences that the conflict would have, disproportionately affecting those with the least resources, by interrupting supply chains, taking the World Food Programme food price index to its highest level ever. Although the export of cereals in themselves does not constitute food aid, they continue to play a vital role in alleviation of food insecurity globally, and that's why we regret that the grain initiative was suspended 4 months ago. Finally, Mr. President, we would urge everyone to examine alternatives for restoring peace and security in Ukraine based on the respect for the sovereignty, unity, independence and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders and extending to its territorial waters. Thank you.
Okay. I thank the representative of Ecuador, and I now give the floor to Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Assistant Secretary General, Yencha, and Mr. Mathieu for their insights on this important issue. This Council has been meeting consistently to address the conflict in Ukraine. Unfortunately, the situation on the ground is worsening despite all our calls from and outside this Council for cessation of hostilities. Reports from the battlefield indicate a stalemate. As we said time and again, there is no military solution to this conflict. The cost of this war is very high, resulting in a humanitarian crisis, food insecurity, human rights violations, destruction of civilian infrastructure, killing and injured persons and arms race. Apart from short-term impact, the expected medium-term and long-term effects on global geopolitical and economic order will be grave and felt globally. The longer the conflict drags on, the more dramatic the consequences for the contending parties, the region, and the globe, with disproportionate impacts on the least developing countries. As a matter of fact, a paradigm shift is needed. The Security Council should play a bridging role to build confidence and create necessary conditions for dialogue to thrive. Let us give a real chance to dialogue. Time has come and the reality demands so. With that in mind, once again, Mozambique calls on the contending parties to display the required flexibility and political will to cease all hostilities, engage in constructive and direct negotiation without preconditions. In our humble assessment, a political negotiation is the most effective and viable way towards finding a common, agreeable, and sustainable solution to resolve this conflict. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique. I now give the floor to Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, colleagues, I thank our briefers, Assistant Secretary General Jenka and Mr. Hollingworth, for their thorough updates, and I welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Ukraine in this meeting. We regret that once again this Council meets to discuss the war in Ukraine without any progress in the dialogue between the parties, either directly or indirectly, or any slightest sign of de-escalation of the conflict. The continuation of hostilities imposes immense suffering on the civilian population and risks exacerbating spillover effects. We call on all parties to adhere to international humanitarian law and take concrete steps to de-escalate hostilities. We urge all parties to pragmatically engage in talks with an aim to a just and lasting peace. The pursuit of a peaceful solution to the crisis is a duty of all, including those with influence on the ground. Brazil welcomes the efforts of members of the international community in this regard and remains willing to contribute to peace initiatives as soon as the parties are ready to re-establish dialogue either directly or through third parties. We encourage parties to resume negotiations on specific issues such as the safety of nuclear facilities and the resumption of the Black Sea Grain Initiative to reduce food security risks for millions, particularly in developing countries. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil. I now give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we would like to sincerely thank Albania and the United States for convening this meeting. And I am saying this without any irony whatsoever. We ourselves were thinking of convening a Security Council meeting on Ukraine today, on the 21st of November, because this is a symbolic day for the continuing Ukrainian tragedy and a milestone in the context of the Ukrainian conflict. Because it is on this day, 10 days ago, anti-governmental protests in Kyiv began. 3 months later, they resulted in a bloody anti-constitutional coup and the whole chain of subsequent tragic, not to say fateful, for Ukraine events. And the ultimate result was a systemic crisis of the state, which today is a strong threat for international peace and security. And since we are here today, we think it would make sense to dwell a bit on the events of those of that time. The formal reason for the beginning of the protest on the 21st of November 2013, as we recall, was a sovereign and a perfectly legitimate decision made by the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine to suspend preparing the association agreement with the European Union. This decision was not made under pressure and not in the interest of Russia, as the historians of Maidan are trying to present. Rather, it was to ensure the national security of Ukraine. The leadership of the country realized that it was objectively impossible to modernize economy in a limited time in order to keep it competitive with European manufacturers. Furthermore, signing the agreement created objective difficulties for the trade and economic interactions between Ukraine and Russia and other countries of the CIS. All of this became obvious after the draft text was published, which was worked upon in camera, away from the public gaze. The government, guided by the national interest, made the decision to not even cancel, but to postpone such a far-reaching decision. But this led to a sharp and coordinated reaction on the part of the far-right radical Ukrainian forces. Also, the NGOs, which had been financed by the U.S. for a long time, became intensified. One of the architects of the Maidan coup, Victoria Nuland, in her interview to CNN in 2014, said that the United States since 1991 has allocated $5 billion for that purposes. Clearly, in losing this investment was not part of the plan. And already in the evening, the Independence Square in Kiev saw the gatherings of the so-called activists with EU flags. 1 week prior to that, by the way, on the 13th of November, a well-known participant of the Orange Revolution in 2004, it was the first failed coup in Ukraine, that gentleman, Yuri Lutsenko, called on opposition to unite and undertake mass actions in case their demands for European integration were not met. Essentially, this was a blackmail by a loud, small, but very active and motivated minority, which had unlimited support from the United States and its allies. I'm not now going to go into the detail about how radical nationalists implement page by page the scenario of the Maidan coup prepared in the West. Let me just say that one of the more important elements here was a criminal provocation by the radical opposition, which included the shooting of protesters in Maidan, as a result of which more than 100 people died. The fact that these people were not killed by the law enforcement is something that we now know very well. There was also political cheating, because the opposition on the very next morning disavowed the agreement, which was signed with the guarantees of Germany, France, and Poland, the agreement on a transitional period, and relieved Mr. Yanukovych from his authority in violation of the country's constitution. And at the same time, they took over government buildings. We will provide an opportunity to hear about this in detail. We'll give an opportunity to the participants of the events to tell about them during the special meeting of the Council on the ARIA formula, which will hold on the 8th of December. Our Western colleagues closed their eyes to this lawlessness and thus became an accessory to this original sin, because of which Ukraine is now slowly but surely sliding into an abyss. Need I say that this bloody provocation on Maidan has not been investigated to date, nor was the burning alive of the activists who disagreed with Maidan at the trade union house in Odessa, and the slaughter of the peaceful citizen Mariupol in 9th of May of 2014. We'll do everything we can to make sure that the perpetrators of these crimes, and many of them under the current authorities in Kiev, are not even hiding, to make sure that they get the punishment they deserve. Intoxicated with their own impunity and unlimited Western support, the Maidan junta started prosecuting Russian-speaking Ukrainians, their rights and their historical valuables, and set the course to glorify Nazi accomplices. The heroes of Ukraine were appointed the war criminals and Nazi collaborations, Shuhevich and Bandera, responsible for the killings of the Jews, Poles, Russians, and Ukrainians during World War II. Contemporary Ukrainian nationals are not even hiding what is it that they revere their Nazi idols for. The chairman of the ultra-right party Svoboda, Mr. Tagnibok, praised, and I quote, them for fighting Muscovites, Jews, and other evil creatures who wanted to take the Ukrainian state away from us. As a result of that, the Crimea split from Ukraine, and people in the south and the southeast of Ukraine refused to subordinate themselves to them. After that, Kiev started a punitive operation against them. Even after they received a pushback, even after the Minsk agreements, the Kiev clique missed a chance to bring the LPR and NDR back and stonewall the implementation of the document. As we know, the Minsk agreements became for Kiev and its Western sponsors a smokescreen to prepare for war with Russia. Because, as we now know as well, Maidan was originally thought of as a way to weaken Russia. Ukrainians and their European ambitions were being used in implementing the kind of scenario we're seeing today, and which doesn't have any Ukrainian interest per se. The chance for peace was lost by Ukraine at least twice already, in the case of with the Minsk agreements and also in March-April 2022 in the course of the special military operation. And then, because of the pressure by United States and UK, the Zelensky regime refused to continue peace negotiations with Russia and opted for a senseless war down to the last Ukrainian in a futile attempt to please the West by imposing strategic defense on a nuclear power. But, Mr. President, we remember another Ukraine before Maidan, the country with which we have historic, cultural and family links, the people who shares religion and tradition with us. And this was reminded for us in the Council by a representative of Russian Orthodox Church on the 17th of November. There is no doubt today that 10 years ago, Maidan has become the event which divided the history of Ukraine into before and after period and split the entire Ukrainian society. And this was not a choice between archaic Russia and progressive West. Is now being presented in Kiev in Western capitals. It was a choice between civilization identity on the basis of historic affinity among Slavic peoples on the one hand, and fully losing national identity, becoming devoid of opinion, puppet of the West, replete with corruption and with hideous manifestations of nationalism. Today, increasingly, a number of Ukrainians is becoming aware of that, regardless of how Western propaganda is trying to keep them away from it. We can see that the Ukrainian people are getting out of this intoxication, understand the disastrous situation, and start asking the right questions. For example, why is it the canonical Orthodox faith of millions of people in this country is being prosecuted and destroyed, whereas the church, which is being created by the current authorities, a schismatic one, is being imposed? Why is it the Russian language native for most Ukrainians is being ousted from the government public sphere, whereas the Western states and Ukraine, Western civilized states, Ukraine thinks she is one of them, the rights of minorities, including linguistic rights, are being upheld? Why is it that all of the key decisions on defense, economy, foreign policy are being made by the external sponsors? The fertile lands of the country are being bought up by foreign corporations. Why is it that the West defense companies obtain fabulous profits by supplying Ukraine with armaments, whereas they are being given old cast-offs that NATO countries in any event wanted to get rid of? Or why is it the president of the country is almost sending the elderly and the children to the front, while he himself is trying to hold on to power at any price by tightening the screws against any kind of dissent or any kind of opposition? Unfortunately, a fully fledged discussion on these and other issues will probably not begin within Ukraine for as long as the regime there senses the unconditional support of the West which continues thinking of the Ukrainian project as the best opportunity to weaken Russia. And for as long as the dictator Zelensky will continue arresting or jailing anyone who disagrees with him, or even someone who tries to get access to alternative news. So far on the ground, the only thing we see is a frenzied desire by the Kiev regime to continue with their doomed attempts to inflict defeat on my country after the resounding failure of the so-called summer counter-offensive, colossal losses, using up military equipment, hundreds of thousands of munitions. Kiev is now concentrating on striking against the peaceful citizens. For that, the long-range munitions from the West are very good. The Kiev regime is using the terrorist methods of ISIS and is bragging about that. And in the absence of any resonance by Zelensky and accomplices, but as well as Western puppeteers, to talk about how we can get to this scenario where Ukraine is no longer an anti-Russia, that becomes a good neighbor and civilized development, we will continue going after the purposes of our special military operation. And every day this goal is coming closer and closer with all the ramifications that this means for Ukraine. I would like to draw attention of all of those who repeated today the hackneyed mantra saying that Russia supposedly is striking against the civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, whereas in actual fact it's against military infrastructure, making life in this country is impossible. I'd like to draw your attention to a recent piece of news in Israeli mass media and Agence France Presse. It says that 4,000 refugees from Israel with Ukrainian passports decided to return to Ukraine because, according to them, it's more safe there. So they prefer to go back from Israel, where, as you know, it is much more safer to be there than in the Gaza Strip, which is being flattened currently. But this is a situation that our Western colleagues prefer not to notice because of their double standards. So let me repeat my question to you, the question that I put at the previous meeting we had on the humanitarian situation on Ukraine. How many meetings on the humanitarian situation in Gaza have you convened? Let me answer the question. Not a single one. It's easier for you to push forward lies and fabrications instead about the Russian attacks against civilians in the country where refugees from Israel want to come. I hope you understand ourselves how pathetic and inadequate that looks. I'd like to think so. Distinguished colleagues, the tragic experience of Ukraine should become a warning for all of those countries where the West recently has planted its networks consisting of tame NGOs and the agents of influence, getting ready to use them for their narrow geopolitical purposes. We can see that having launched this clockwork mechanism, the United States and allies will stop in front of no crime or victims and will go ahead with any kind of human rights violations and continue with a double standard. It doesn't matter how long we hear in this room about the so-called revolution of dignity. No one mentioned that today, by the way, even though it's a 10-year anniversary of the revolution of dignity and strengthening of Ukrainian independence. It is clear that 10 years ago, Ukraine lost its dignity and independence, and it hasn't regained it back because it hasn't overcome the original sin of the Maidan. And when it does overcome it, it will stand as a shameful black page in its history of Ukraine and the world as a whole, and as a grim reminder of what it costs when you reject one's own interests and fully subordinate to the West. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank ASG Jenka as well as Representative Hollingworth for their insightful briefings, and acknowledge the participation of the PR of Ukraine and the head of delegation of the European Union representation. As part of its illegal war of aggression, Russia has developed a devastating campaign of systematic airstrikes against civilians and critical infrastructure. These brutal attacks have only one objective: to inflict human suffering on Ukraine and its citizens by depriving them of electricity, heating, education, medical care and food, as well as destroying Ukraine's grain export capacities. The multi-layered consequences of this war will take years to overcome and heal. It is estimated that 44% of Ukrainians have experienced being in a combat zone, and 69% suffer from psychological distress. Last week, Russian forces shelled a hospital and homes in Kherson, killing 3 people and injuring at least 13. Such attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure add to the growing evidence that Russia is committing war crimes, as reported by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. As winter sets in, the continued attacks on energy infrastructure bring a new dimension to the humanitarian crisis. Last winter, thousands of Russian drones and missiles targeted power systems, leading to a severe energy crisis, leaving millions without electricity, water, or heating. This year, the brutal and relentless pattern of Russian attacks has already begun. In recent weeks, Ukrainian energy facilities have been attacked at least 60 times with different types of weaponry. On its part, Malta welcomes OCHA's winter response plan to address specific humanitarian needs in Ukraine. We will continue to support the Ukrainian people by providing humanitarian aid and assistance as long as necessary. President, Russia's unilateral decision to terminate the Black Sea Grain Initiative, as well as its campaign to deliberately attack Ukraine's grain storage and export facilities, has destroyed 300,000 tons of Ukrainian grain. This is a criminal act and is a clear evidence of how Russia continues to instrumentalize food and undermine global food security, as well as a cynical attempt to deprive Ukraine of income. In response to this, the EU solidarity lanes will continue to assist Ukraine and deliver an ambitious response to address global food insecurity. We also express our grave concern about the recent attack against a civilian vessel in the Ukrainian Black Sea port of Odessa. This was the first time civilians have been killed and injured on board a merchant ship. Russia must cease all attacks against Ukrainian seaports and allow freedom of navigation on the Black Sea. These attacks go against international humanitarian law, strictly prohibiting attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. We remain resolute in our position that perpetrators of such atrocities must be held accountable, and we support all efforts to this end, including the ongoing ICC and ICJ processes, as well as the ongoing discussions on the establishment of a special tribunal on the crimes of aggression against Ukraine. In closing, President, we underscore once again our conviction that to achieve a just and lasting peace, Russia must immediately cease all hostilities. It must unconditionally, as well as completely, withdraw all its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for the statement. I shall now make a statement as the representative of China. On the issue of Ukraine, China always stands on the side of fairness and justice, on the side of peace, and on the side of dialogue. We are committed to facilitating talks for peace and to realizing a ceasefire. We call on the parties to the conflict to respond positively to the international community's call for peace and to gradually create and accumulate conditions for the resumption of peace talks as soon as possible. The Ukraine crisis has been dragging on, resulting in varying degrees of damage to many large infrastructure in the conflict areas, a severe shortage of supplies, and difficulties in accessing essential public services such as water, electricity, and heating, and a worrisome humanitarian situation. The parties to the conflict must strictly abide by international humanitarian law and refrain from attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure. The international community and the humanitarian agencies should, on the basis of the principle of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, step up humanitarian assistance to the people affected by the crisis, speed up the repair of civilian infrastructure, provide winter supplies and heating appliances to the affected population, and ensure the basic livelihood of the displaced persons. A prolonged and complex crisis in Ukraine is not in the interest of any party, and the developing countries are the most affected by its spillover effects. The imposition of unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction outside international law will only disrupt and destabilize the global industrial and supply chains and slow down the realization of the goals of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We call on the international community to step up its efforts, in particular on countries with major influence, to play an active role in avoiding the continued spread of the spillover effects of the crisis, creating a conducive environment for peace, and steering the situation back to the right track of a political settlement at an earlier date. I resume my function as the President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Assistant Secretary General, World Food Programme representative in Ukraine. I also recognize here Putin's envoy in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. This country now defunct, but still present in the UN Charter. It killed millions of people during the Great Famine of 1932 to 1933 in Ukraine. This Saturday, we will pay tribute to the memory of the victims of the tragedy of Holodomor, as we call it in Ukrainian. It was the result of a deliberate policy of starvation aimed at crushing any resistance to Moscow's rule in Ukraine and stamping out any aspirations of Ukrainians towards independence. As it was 90 years ago, Russia again seeks to break the will of Ukrainians to resist. Both Stalin and Putin opted for a genocidal toolbox, as other methods of subjugating the Ukrainian people did not work. Stalin resorted to total confiscation of food and starving people to death. Putin has ordered a full-scale military invasion. And the historical memory of Holodomor contributes to the current resilience of the Ukrainian people. We fight the same aggressor that organized the deadly hunger in Ukraine 90 years ago. Now they have a much more sophisticated toolbox at their disposal. All kinds of weapons, including missiles and UAVs, but deliberate starvation remains one of their weapons, as it was 90 years ago. This time it is used not only against Ukraine, but against the entire world, including the most vulnerable in Africa and Asia. The delegation of Ukraine has initiated the declaration of the UN member states on the occasion of the anniversary, due to be issued later this week. We believe that the Holodomor should be a reminder for present and future generations to unconditionally respect human rights in order to prevent the perpetration of such tragedies. The UN member states will also send an important message of the need to prevent the weaponization of food against a backdrop of the disruption of production and supply chains, which increases global food insecurity, especially for the most vulnerable. "20 years ago, the current boss of the Russian representative has co-signed the following statement, and I would like to quote from it. In the former Soviet Union, millions of men, women and children fell victims to the cruel actions and policies of the totalitarian regime. The Great Famine in Ukraine, Holodomor, which took from 7 to 10 million innocent lives, and because the national tragedy for the Ukrainian people. Expressing sympathy to the victims of the Great Famine, Holodomor, we call upon all member states, the United Nations, all international and regional organizations, as well as non-governmental organizations, foundations and associations to pay tribute to the memory of those who perished during that tragic period of history, Sergei Lavrov, along with other ambassadors to the United Nations, 20 years ago, November 2003. So where are you today? I'm grateful to those Security Council members and other UN member states who have already joined the declaration of this year. And I invite other delegations to do likewise. Perhaps the Russian delegation would like to join again, since your boss, Sergei Lavrov, has signed it in 2003. Mr. President, starvation is one of Russia's methods of warfare, has encompassed various components since day one of the full-scale invasion. These include blocking Ukrainian food exports, shelling Ukrainian ports and grain stores, mining Ukrainian fertile soils, and turning them into battlefields. For instance, due to the blockade of the Ukrainian coast by Russia, the processing of goods by Ukraine's seaports decreased by 61.5%. The sharp increase in world grain prices that followed the blockade was also on Russia's wish list as a grain exporter. Nevertheless, Ukraine remains committed to contributing to food security. The Black Sea Grain Initiative served as a powerful example of this commitment. Restoring Ukrainian maritime supplies of grain and foodstuffs helped to gradually stabilize and reduce world food prices, particularly for wheat and sunflower oil. In 1 year of the BSGI operation, Ukraine exported more than 33 million tons of agricultural products to 45 countries, with 60% of the volume going to the countries of Africa and Asia. These figures would have been much higher if Russia had not impeded the functioning of the initiative before then withdrawing from it in July this year. Instead, Russia has started regular missile attacks on Ukrainian port infrastructure and grain stores. Since July 18, 167 port infrastructure facilities and 7 civilian vessels have been damaged and partially destroyed as a result of Russian attacks on Ukrainian seaports. More than 20 civilians have been injured. On November 8, Russia attacked a civilian vessel operating under the flag of Liberia. As a result, 1 crew member was killed, 3 crew members and a port employee wounded. Even today, just several hours ago, the aggressor attacked the civilian infrastructure of Ukrainian ports with missiles. As a result, the missile terror Ukraine has experienced a 40% reduction in the export potential of its ports. Around 300,000 tons of grain have been destroyed. The export of grain cargoes to the countries of Asia, Africa, and Europe has been reduced by almost 3 million tons per month. These actions, devoid of any military objective, only serve to exacerbate the global food crisis. Ukraine is committed to preventing Russia from instigating hunger worldwide. That is why the peace formula proposed by the President of Ukraine last year encompasses food security as an integral part of a comprehensive, just and lasting peace. The right to food is inalienable for all people, for all countries, along with the right to life and liberty. Every country should be protected from famine. This is the ideology of the peace formula. While work on the peace formula is already underway, it is essential to curtail Russia's ability to wield food as a weapon even right now. As of mid-November, Ukraine harvested nearly 76 million tons of crops, including over 53 million tons of grains and more than 22 million tons of oilseeds. We are ready to continue food exports to the global market. While working for the restoration of free navigation in the Black Sea, Ukraine rejects any acceptance of Russian ultimatums regarding the grain deal. On August 8th, temporary rules for civilian vessels to and from the Ukrainian Black Sea ports came into effect. Over 116 vessels have already used this new alternative sea corridor from the ports of Odessa, Chornomorsk, and Pivdenny. Ukraine effectively continues to implement the Black Sea Grain Initiative by using alternative routes. The most efficient in terms of grain export is the Danube corridor. Ukrainian grain has been exported through Croatian ports. On October the 3rd, Lithuania agreed on a corridor for Ukrainian grain transit to the Baltic ports. On October the 10th, a new grain corridor through Moldova and Romania was announced. On October 17th, the port of Riga received the first test container train carrying Ukrainian agricultural products. We are consistently working to increase the throughput of all corridors combined. The government has approved new rules for exporting agricultural products to prevent abuse and violations of the law during the export process. These rules also serve to protect business that comply with export legislation. Last year, the humanitarian initiative Grain from Ukraine was launched by the President of Ukraine and presented during the first inaugural International Summit on Food Security in Kiev on November 26. More than 30 countries and international organizations have joined the Grain from Ukraine initiative to help countries of Africa and Asia. Now Ukraine intends to send more vessels with humanitarian grain to African countries, in particular 25,000 tons to Nigeria. Grain from Ukraine initiative will now apply to Ukraine's Danube ports. We call on countries from across the globe to join this initiative. Among other issues, we can consider creation of food logistics hubs in the countries of the Global South for the supply of Ukraine's agricultural products. The second international summit, Grain from Ukraine, will be held in Kiev on November 25th under the auspices of the President of Ukraine. The upcoming summit's extended format will allow us to explore additional opportunities. We aim to agree on an algorithm for cooperation in the context of implementing joint projects for grain storage, primary processing and transporting agricultural products to recipient countries. We also welcome the Global Food Security Summit that was held in London yesterday. We appreciate that the joint ministerial statement between the United Kingdom, the United Arab Emirates and Somalia has also highlighted the nexus between conflicts and food security, as well as emphasized that food must not be used as a weapon of war. Mr. President, it was also yesterday that we marked World Children's Day. The right to food is a human right, while for a child, a proper nutrition is of fundamental importance. Well-nourished children grow and develop to their full potential. According to UNICEF, in 2022, an estimated 45 million children under 5, that is 6.8%, were affected by wasting, of which 37.7 million were suffering from severe wasting. More than 3/4 of all children with severe wasting live in Asia, and another 22% live in Africa. By waging its unprovoked war against my country, Russia denies millions of children in the most vulnerable countries of their right to food and proper nutrition. We reiterate once again that as long as Russia's aggressive behavior continues, global food security will remain under threat. Removing aggressive patterns from the Kremlin's mindset requires Russia's defeat in Ukraine. And as soon as comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, based on the UN Charter principles, is achieved, our common efforts on food security will be more effective. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Olof Skog, head of the delegation of the EU to the United Nations.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Colleagues, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states, the candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, Republic of Moldova and Bosnia-Herzegovina, potential candidate country Georgia, as well as Andorra, Monaco and San Marino all align themselves with this brief statement. Thank you to you, Mr. President, for the opportunity to address the Security Council. There were other EU countries that would have liked to have spoken today, given how affected they are also of the situation that we're discussing today. I want to thank the briefers for their presentations. And Mr. President, I want to say also at the outset to reiterate the EU's resolute condemnation of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which constitutes a manifest violation of the UN Charter. The consequences of the aggression has been, I think, made very clear by the two briefers today, both the consequences for Ukraine but also on the global food security situation. I reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, as well as its inherent right of self-defense against the Russian aggression. I want to make two further points. One, about Russia's targeting of Ukraine's critical infrastructure and how unacceptable that is and that it must stop. And secondly, the European Union's full engagement in efforts to address the global consequences of the Russian aggression. Russia's ongoing systematic airstrikes against civilian objects and critical infrastructure in Ukraine are unacceptable and they must stop. Such intentional attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure add to the growing evidence of war crimes as reported by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. Russia and its leadership must be held fully accountable for waging a war of aggression against Ukraine and other most serious crimes under international law. In the face of continued Russian attacks against Ukraine's civil and critical infrastructure, the European Union will intensify our provision of humanitarian and civil protection assistance to Ukraine, including equipment such as power generators, power transformers, mobile heating stations and high voltage and lighting equipment to help Ukraine and its people face yet another winter at war. Via the EU Civil Protection Mechanism, we have sent more than 5,000 power generators to Ukraine. According to the 2023 UN Humanitarian Response Plan, 11.1 million people are food insecure in Ukraine. Last week, we announced an additional 100 million euros in humanitarian support to those most vulnerable, especially in hard-to-reach areas. This will allow our humanitarian partners to provide essential services such as cash assistance, food, water, shelter, healthcare, psychosocial support and protection. It brings the total for EU humanitarian aid in response to Russia's war to 785 million euros. Unfortunately, humanitarian access remains critical, and the EU fully supports efforts by the UN and all relevant stakeholders to engage in negotiations with all parties to provide full, safe, unhindered and durable humanitarian access, in particular in areas under the temporary military control of the Russian Federation. Russia's unilateral decision to terminate the Black Sea Grain Initiative, as many colleagues have pointed out today, and its deliberate attacks on Ukraine's grain storage and export facilities, as well as its actions to hinder the freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, show that Russia continues to weaponize food. By doing so, it deliberately undermines global food security. And I stress the importance of security, stability and freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, which is vital for sustainable grain exports. We praise Ukraine for its unwavering efforts to resume grain exports via maritime routes, as we just heard, including through the organization of the Second International Summit on Food Security next week. The successful establishment of the Ukraine Corridor for civil cargo ships has allowed Ukraine to export over 1.5 million tons of food, thus contributing to enhancing global food security. We commend efforts by Ukraine and the private sector to put in place an insurance scheme that reduces the costs of this route. Through Ukraine's own Grain from Ukraine program, over 170,000 metric tons of grain have been donated to countries in need, including Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, Sudan and Yemen. We condemn the devastating attack on a civilian cargo ship in the Ukrainian port of Pivdeni earlier this month. The EU supports all efforts, including those of the United Nations, to facilitate exports of Ukraine's grain and other agricultural products to the countries most in need, notably in Africa and in the Middle East. We will also further enhance the capacity of the EU solidarity lanes to facilitate transit and export via land routes to world markets, which have enabled the export of more than 57 million tons of Ukrainian agricultural products so far. In addition, we will continue to deliver on our ambitious response to address global food insecurity. Together with our member states, we are providing 18 billion euros in grants to countries and people in need, including humanitarian and food assistance. Tragically, the weaponization of food is nothing new. Every year, towards the end of November, as we've heard today, Ukraine commemorates the Holodomor famine and its victims. This year, it's the 90th anniversary of the Soviet Union's use of hunger as a weapon against the Ukrainian people. The EU and its member states joined Ukraine in honoring the millions of victims of this terrible crime. If we do not educate ourselves about our history, we risk repeating our mistakes. That is why we support Ukraine's initiative of a joint declaration, and we call on all other UN members to support it as well. Mr. President, in closing, I emphasize that the European Union will continue to provide strong financial, economic, humanitarian, military and diplomatic support to Ukraine and its people for as long as it takes. We will continue our intensified diplomatic outreach efforts and cooperation with Ukraine and other countries to ensure the widest possible international support for a comprehensive, just and lasting peace and the key principles and objectives of Ukraine's peace formula. I thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Skoog for his statement. Before adjourning the meeting, I should like to note that the following delegations have submitted written statements: Estonia and Denmark. These statements will be circulated to Council members and will be issued as official documents of the Security Council. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
I don't think they will speak.